No historian can tell you what lies behind those locked Vatican doors. Not because they lack theories or curiosity or archival obsession, but because they have never been allowed to cross those thresholds at all. There are rooms in the Vatican archives that remain sealed, even from the most credentialed scholars' rooms. Quietly guarded rooms every guide politely pretends do not exist. You walk past them with a badge, with a letter of approval, with years spent earning access, and still the doors do not open. Why, what truth demands darkness, and what survives in that darkness that could shake the world above it? So breathe out for a moment, letting the sharpness of that question soften, because the deeper you follow this path, the more gently you'll want to move through it. You find yourself standing beneath the long stone corridors of the Vatican, where a cool hush clings to the air and the faint scent of old parchment floats like dust suspended in a cathedral's morning light. Down here, history doesn't feel written. It feels stored, coiled, waiting. Scholars cradle documents that witnessed plagues, wars, coronations, and scandals, yet even they will tell you that the most guarded stories remain hidden beyond a handful of locked rooms no visitor is ever permitted to approach. As you imagine the dim glow of lamps brushing across endless shelves, you sense the quiet tension in this place, the feeling that something more is being protected, something never meant to slip into public daylight. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And now, with a slow breath and steady steps, you and I will walk deeper into the silence toward the doors no scholar has ever opened, tracing the reasons they were sealed in the first place and the mysteries they still guard. You return to those stone corridors in your mind, the ones where the air felt cool enough to quiet your thoughts, and the lamps revealed only the edges of what you were allowed to see. As you move deeper, you begin to understand why people call this place a fortress. Not because it has battlements or guards pacing the halls, but because every line of mortar, every precisely filed document, every ritual of access feels built to shield something far larger than paper. You walk slowly, hearing the echo of your own steps, remembering how the sealed doors earlier seemed to hold their breath as you passed, as if the silence itself had been trained to keep secrets. It helps to recall that the modern Vatican archives, despite their almost mythical reputation, are not ancient. The foundational structure dates to the early 17th century, when Pope Paul V formally gathered the Church's scattered administrative records into one protected space. That part is an established fact. 1612, an organized repository, a centralization of power through the preservation of memory. Centuries later, expansions and climate-controlled vaults layered even more security onto that foundation. The result became a physical manifestation of institutional caution, where knowledge is both preserved and curated with almost obsessive care. This is the kind of place where even the dust motes seem to follow rules. But what makes this fortress unusual is not its size or age. It's the way it has been engineered to conceal as much as it reveals. As you wander through the imagined galleries of manuscripts and parchments, you notice an architectural oddity that scholars sometimes whisper about over espresso narrow hallways that appear to curve into nothing, staircases that are always locked, and temperature-controlled rooms whose windows are frosted from the inside. These whispers aren't entirely fiction. Archivists occasionally mention wings built during renovations that no researcher, even with the highest credentials, has ever reportedly worked in. The official explanation is always the same: climate zones, maintenance storage, or simply not relevant to scholar access. The phrasing feels familiar, like the polite tone used when strangers discreetly redirect your attention away from something you weren't supposed to notice. Among the obscure details that circulate quietly is the claim that during the 20th century modernization of the archives, engineers encountered older undocumented chambers beneath the primary floors. According to a rare interview given decades ago by a retired architect, one difficult to verify but too persistent to dismiss, some of these chambers were reinforced and sealed rather than integrated. He described a pattern of construction suggesting that whoever oversaw the work wanted to keep certain areas inaccessible, not only to the public, but even to future archivists. You can almost imagine those chambers now locked behind the same heavy hush that surrounded the doors you visualized earlier, tucked away like memories the Church prefers not to revisit. And yet, for all these hints of hidden spaces, no one knows precisely what necessitated such elaborate protection. Here is where the scholarly debate becomes almost irresistible. One school of thought argues that the fortress-like design reflects nothing more than bureaucratic precision, a practical need to safeguard fragile artifacts from humidity and mishandling. Another school suggests that the design reveals an anxiety about narrative control, that the Church understood the power of archives not merely as storage, but as guardianship over how history would be told. If the latter is true, then the silence you felt in those hallways isn't emptiness, it's strategy. Still, there's an open question that lingers. Why would certain rooms need to be sealed in ways that even authorized experts cannot override? Not locked temporarily for restoration or conservation, but effectively erased from the usable map of the archives. It's the same question that pulsed through your thoughts when you stood before those forbidden doors earlier. What exists inside that cannot withstand scrutiny? Scholars who support the bureaucratic explanation often point to sensitive diplomatic records, fragile materials, or items requiring special handling. Others counter that such items are routinely studied under controlled conditions. Sealing entire rooms permanently goes beyond protection and enters the realm of purposeful obscurity. As you drift deeper into the imagining, your steps retrace the path that began with that first shocking realization. Not everything in the archives has been meant to be found. You remember the cool hush from the introduction, a detail that now colors your understanding of this space, hinting that the silence itself is part of the architecture. It's as if the building learned to keep its composure across centuries, each expansion reinforcing not only the walls, but the culture of careful withholding. Even the method of requesting documents through cards, codes, and clerical approval feels like a ritual meant to remind you that this fortress opens only where it agrees to open. One curious historical fact adds texture to the puzzle. For centuries, the archives were completely closed to outside researchers. Access for scholars began only in 1881 after Leo XIII declared the doors open to academic inquiry. Even then, the gesture was cautious. Entire periods remained unavailable, and the pace of declassification moved like incense smoke, drifting through a cathedral, slow, deliberate, shaped by unseen currents. The policy shift was heralded as an act of transparency, yet it simultaneously highlighted what remained hidden. If the building was a fortress before it simply became one with a controlled front gate. What complicates the matter further is the ongoing tension between transparency and secrecy. Modern researchers push for greater access, arguing that history thrives on sunlight. The Church replies that some materials are too fragile, too sensitive, or too context-dependent to release without misinterpretation. Both arguments have merit, and both leave unanswered the uncomfortable question: who decides which truths the world is ready to receive? You feel yourself slowing as this realization settles. The corridors, the sealed doors, the architectural redesigns, the obscure rumors about reinforced chambers, all of them create a portrait of a place built not merely to store knowledge, but to curate revelation itself. And as you stand in that imagined quiet, the fortress feels less like a building and more like a state of mind designed to ensure that some stories will never wander into daylight unless someone somewhere turns a hidden key. You move through the imagined archives with a steadier confidence, now tracing the outline of that fortress-like silence from earlier, and soon you arrive at one of the most peculiar aspects of this subterranean world, the spaces that appear to exist and not exist at the same time. It begins with something deceptively mundane. Every archive relies on catalogs, indexes, shelf codes, and inventories, because without them, knowledge dissolves into chaos. Yet here among the Vatican's meticulously recorded miles of shelving, researchers occasionally stumble upon anomalies, doors indicated on architectural diagrams, but absent from the internal access registry, or corridors sketched faintly in renovation reports that the modern catalog makes no reference to. These aren't rumors whispered by tourists. They're inconsistencies noticed by scholars who spend their lives studying order, not chasing shadows. And while they often mention the discrepancies with a polite shrug, the details linger like a tickle at the edge of your curiosity. One established historical fact deepens the intrigue. During the Napoleonic invasion of Rome in 1810, a massive portion of the Vatican archives was seized and transported to Paris. When the records were eventually returned after the fall of Napoleon, archivists documented losses, damages, and relocations. The chaotic movement of this enormous collection forced multiple restructurings in the decades that followed. Entire wings were rearranged, storage areas repurposed, and in some cases rooms were sealed because their organizational context had vanished. On paper, these decisions were practical. In practice, they left behind architectural scars, spaces whose status became ambiguous, forgotten, or quietly omitted during later catalog revisions. Yet amid these perfectly plausible bureaucratic explanations lies a more obscure detail, one that archivists rarely discuss openly. A retired custodian mentioned in an old interview that during the late 19th century, long after the Napoleonic upheaval, a private committee oversaw a discreet reorganization. According to his account, certain collections were relocated overnight without accompanying documentation. Shelves were emptied and refilled behind curtains drawn across work areas. And in at least one instance, a room was stripped entirely and bricked over within the same week. The custodian didn't claim to know why. He simply recalled the pace rushed urgent and oddly silent, as if the workers had been instructed to reduce the sound of their movements. Whether this account reflects misremembered events or something more deliberate is impossible to verify, yet the story circulates often enough to have acquired a strangely persistent weight. And so you find yourself asking the kind of open questions scholars debate in low voices during conference dinners. If a space is removed from the catalog, does it disappear from history, or does it become even more important? The Vatican insists that no access list is perfect, that maintenance rooms, unused alcoves, and obsolete storage areas naturally fall out of circulation. Researchers counter that the precision of this archive makes accidental omission improbable. A climate control closet might be forgotten, but not a room large enough to require dedicated shelving lighting and secure entry. The tension between these explanations creates a gentle friction, like two pages of parchment pressing against each other without quite aligning. As you wander deeper into this imagined network of half-acknowledged spaces, the atmosphere shifts, subtly echoing the earlier sense of moving through a fortress of silence. You begin to understand how easily a room could exist physically, while disappearing administratively. If a catalog number is never assigned, the room effectively becomes part of the building's skeleton, a structural component, rather than a research space. It sits quietly, absorbing the surrounding darkness, waiting for no one. And if the door happens to be reinforced or always locked or tucked behind a shelving corridor that few people use, it becomes something even more interesting, a ghostly presence hiding in plain sight. One archivist once commented that the greatest power in any repository is not what it reveals, but what it classifies out of existence. It was meant as a wry statement about bureaucracy, yet the idea lingers as you picture those unnumbered rooms. Imagine shelves of parchment resting in a chamber that does not officially exist. Imagine an archivist 200 years ago deciding something was too volatile, too embarrassing, or too context-dependent to be left in open circulation. The easiest way to hide anything is not to bury it. It is to erase the map that leads to it. You can almost feel a faint shiver of amusement at how simple and clever that sounds. Another curious interpretation emerges from architectural historians who study renovations rather than manuscripts. They note that when buildings are expanded repeatedly over centuries, secretive spaces sometimes arise unintentionally. Voids formed between mismatched floors, narrow rooms created when walls are shifted, but not demolished alcoves that once held staircases now removed. These accidental pockets of architecture are common in medieval structures. Yet the question remains, would a place as obsessively managed as the Vatican archives allow such spaces to remain unassigned for long? And if they were discovered, would they be catalogued or quietly repurposed for something that should not be openly tracked? The callbacks from earlier, especially the lingering memory of sealed doors and the enforced quiet of the corridors, begin to color your perception of these unnumbered spaces. You start to imagine them as part of a broader pattern, not necessarily sinister, but undeniably purposeful. The Vatican is an institution that understands the choreography of information, when to reveal, when to withhold, when to let silence fill the gaps. In a place built so carefully to control narrative, any room without a catalog number feels like a deliberate pause in the story. And so the mystery deepens in a way that feels oddly peaceful. You're not rushing toward answers. You're drifting through possibilities, letting the puzzle rest lightly on your thoughts. Perhaps the unnumbered rooms contain damaged fragments too incomplete to be meaningful. Perhaps they hold diplomatic documents whose context is too volatile for public consumption. Or perhaps they simply house forgotten furniture, stacked chairs, old lamps, and wooden drawers removed during reorganizations. Yet the uncertainty is precisely what keeps you leaning forward, listening to the quiet, waiting for the next subtle clue in this architectural labyrinth of memory and omission. You move onward through the quiet maze, following the thread woven by those unnumbered rooms, and eventually your attention settles on something far more human than architecture, the gatekeepers. Or more accurately, the single gatekeeper. In a place governed by indexes, codes, protocols, and procedure, access ultimately narrows to one figure whose authority determines what the world is permitted to see. The prefect of the Vatican Apostolic Archive. A title that sounds almost ceremonial at first, holds powers that feel anything but symbolic once you understand their scope. The archivists themselves joke gently that this person's keyring could open history itself, although the humor fades as soon as someone asks which doors those keys actually fit. A firmly documented fact shapes your understanding from the start. The prefect has full jurisdiction over entry permissions, document retrieval, and internal access policies. Even cardinals requesting sensitive materials must go through the office of the prefect, not the other way around. The power here is procedural rather than dramatic, yet the effect is extraordinary. When scholars describe awaiting approval, they often speak of it as though requesting an audience with time itself. And of course, the prefect is not alone. There is a staff, a chain of command, and a series of internal workflows. But when it comes to unlocking spaces that most of the world doesn't even know exist, the authority crystallizes around one individual whose decisions determine what knowledge breathes and what remains asleep. You recall the silence of earlier corridors, the near stillness that felt almost trained, and it makes perfect sense that a human counterpart to that architectural quiet would exist. Someone must embody the continuity of discretion. Someone must remember which keys open which doors and decide whether those doors should open at all. And perhaps someone must carry the weight of the rooms that hold no catalog numbers, those quiet anomalies lingering just behind your imagination. There's an obscure detail that flickers at the edges of archival folklore mentioned occasionally by scholars who have spent decades navigating the labyrinth of permissions. It concerns the prefect's private logbook, a handwritten record said to list every restricted access request that has ever been denied. The log itself has never been seen by researchers, and officially it may not even exist, but the story circulates with a consistency that suggests at least a grain of truth. According to those who believe it, the logbook contains not only the names of petitioners, but also cryptic notations indicating the reason for rejection. Some entries allegedly reference documents that do not appear in any known index. Others more unsettlingly note that the requested material is unstable or contextually unsuitable phrases that feel like elegant ways of saying the truth inside could create more problems than it solves. You find yourself lingering on those imagined phrases, rolling them gently across your thoughts, as though testing the texture of their meaning. What would qualify as contextually unsuitable? A document contradicting an official decree. A map revealing the origins of a border dispute. A confession written by a figure later canonized. The possibilities flicker like candlelight. You don't need to reach for dramatic conspiracies. History itself provides more than enough complexity to warrant caution. Still, the existence of such a log, if real, introduces an open question that scholars occasionally debate: should any human being, no matter how principled, hold unilateral authority over pieces of history that may reshape our understanding of entire centuries? With this question comes a subtle callback to that earlier image of unlisted rooms. A locked space without a catalog number is one form of silence. An authority figure whose decisions vanish into private notes is another. The two forms echo each other, deepening the sense that the archival world operates on both physical and philosophical levels. One wall might be made of brick, another made of discretion, yet both accomplish the same thing: control of access. There's a deeper historical layer to consider, one rooted in papal bureaucracy rather than mystery. Since at least the 18th century, the role of prefect has demanded not only scholarship, but also a refined understanding of ecclesiastical politics. The prefect is chosen not simply for organizational skill, but for the ability to sense which documents require delicate handling. Here you find another established fact. Certain archives related to diplomatic negotiations, internal church investigations, and doctrinal deliberations have always been subject to special clearance. This isn't unique to the Vatican. Governments around the world routinely maintain restricted collections. The difference here lies in the weight of centuries pressing down on every page, making the prefect a guardian not just of documents, but of the narrative arcs that shape the very identity of the Church. And yet, for all this authority, the prefect is not an intimidating figure in daily life. Visiting scholars often describe interactions that are polite, restrained, sometimes even warm. The office is often compared to a study rather than a throne room: comfortable chair, neat desk, a faint smell of paper and old bindings. If you arrived there in person, you might even find yourself offering a nervous joke, perhaps, about misplacing your library card, and receiving a patient smile in return. But behind that mild exterior lies the knowledge that this individual could, with a single signature or a quiet refusal, determine whether your research moves forward or collapses into unanswered questions. It's this quiet power that fuels another controversial interpretation whispered among researchers who enjoy indulging in gentle speculation over late-night drinks. They wonder whether the prefect's most important duty is not granting access, but managing the boundaries of what future scholars will be allowed to pursue. If an area of inquiry is deemed too disruptive, perhaps permissions simply decline into silence. If a document threatens to prompt misunderstandings or misreadings, perhaps it is quietly shifted into a room whose number no longer exists. No one accuses the prefect of malice. If anything, the speculation frames the role as one of protection, ensuring that volatile materials do not ignite unnecessary confusion. Here, another open question emerges with a certain softness: how much history can a single person safely hold back before the tension becomes too great? And more importantly, how does someone in that position decide what humanity is ready to understand? As you drift away from this thought, you notice again that echo from earlier moments: the hush of the corridors, the unmapped rooms, the faint suggestion of areas intentionally tucked beyond reach. The keys the prefect carries might not jingle dramatically on an iron ring, yet the authority they symbolize is unmistakable. They unlock paths through the archive that most people will never walk. They open possibilities and they close them. They protect and they conceal. And somewhere in that broad spectrum of responsibility lies the delicate truth that every archive, no matter how vast, ultimately depends on a single human judgment: what may be seen and what must remain in the quiet. You move deeper into the imagined archive, drawn now not by architecture or authority, but by the faintest trace of rumor, those delicate, persistent whispers about a body of documents known only through indirect references, the files of the Apostolic Chamber. The name alone carries a kind of velvet weight, suggesting an office once powerful enough to shape centuries of church finances, diplomacy, and internal governance. Though the chamber still exists today in a ceremonial form, its historical incarnation acted as the financial heart of the papacy, managing revenues, debts, landholdings, and emergency funds that stretched across continents. The fact that this institution maintained meticulous records is beyond dispute. The mystery lies in why certain eras of its documentation seem to have vanished into silence. A well-established historical fact anchors your understanding. In the late Middle Ages, the Apostolic Chamber tracked payments from monarchs and feudal lords, collected income from indulgences, and oversaw tax systems that supported everything from cathedral construction to military campaigns. Financial transparency, at least internally, was essential for maintaining order. So when researchers examine surviving ledgers and correspondence, the regular appearance of detailed accounting makes the sudden absence of materials from particular years stand out dramatically. Scholars sometimes joke that medieval accountants were more obsessive than modern ones, but the truth is that their consistency renders silence suspicious. Where records should exist, gaps appear like missing teeth in an otherwise perfect smile. This leads to an obscure detail that has circulated among archivists for decades: the existence of a sealed grouping of files catalogued only once briefly during a 19th century internal survey. The survey itself is real. Notes from it were published, albeit sparsely, and within those notes lies a brief reference to documents pertaining to extraordinary financial actions of the Apostolic Chamber during times of crisis. No location was listed. No subsequent inventory mentions them. The phrasing "extraordinary financial actions" has a wonderfully vague quality, the kind that invites imagination even as it shuts the door on specifics. One archivist once quipped that this probably meant nothing more dramatic than emergency cash transfers, though he admitted that the vagueness was the kind that makes scholars twitch. You can't help smiling at that thought as you drift onward into the mystery, because twitch-worthy vagueness appears frequently when this subject arises. Researchers have long debated whether such missing documents reflect nothing more than damaged disorganization or poor preservation. Yet others argue that the gaps align too neatly with moments of intense political strain, moments when the Church's financial decisions may have been too complicated or too sensitive to record openly. After all, financial history often reveals truths that diplomacy prefers to forget. But the open question remains, were these files deliberately removed to protect the Church or simply lost through the chaos of time? A gentle callback arises as you remember the earlier image of the prefect holding keys and making decisions about what may be seen. It's easy to imagine that if volatile documents ever required permanent concealment, they would be entrusted to a space that no modern researcher could request by name. When you combine that thought with the unnumbered rooms described earlier, a subtle pattern emerges, not proof of secrecy, but a choreography of caution. These missing financial records may have drifted into one of those silent pockets of the archive, a place where context outweighs curiosity. Another historical thread contributes depth to this thought. During the Renaissance, the Apostolic Chamber oversaw complex negotiations involving loans from powerful banking families, most famously the Medici. Those relationships were not always smooth. Sometimes debts were forgiven in exchange for political alignment. Other times, pressure was exerted behind the scenes in ways no modern financial institution would dare attempt. Surviving correspondence hints at tensions, oblique threats, and arrangements that would have been awkward to immortalize in official ledgers. Scholars wonder if the missing materials relate to these delicate arrangements, notes, instructions, or side agreements never meant for public scrutiny. The possibility feels both plausible and tantalizing, like catching a glimpse of movement behind a distant curtain. Yet another interpretation arises from a quiet remark once made by a financial historian. He suggested that the Church may have relied on certain off-record funds during periods of instability, particularly when threatened by invasion or internal revolt. If such funds existed, then the documentation supporting them, locations of reserves, names of intermediaries, emergency disbursement paths, would have been considered highly sensitive. Too sensitive, perhaps, to leave lying on shelves accessible to anyone with a badge and a research proposal. This interpretation does not accuse anyone of wrongdoing. It simply acknowledges that institutions centuries old have often depended on discreet financial ingenuity to survive. Your mind returns to the custodian's story about rooms bricked over after quiet midnight labor. And suddenly, you begin to sense how financial secrecy might intersect with architectural silence. Money moves quietly in moments of crisis. So do the documents that record those movements. If certain financial files were removed to protect vulnerable political relationships, they may have ended up in precisely the kind of hidden room that never received a catalog number. Another callback drifts gently into place, the idea that the archive is a fortress, not only of paper but of intention. The sealed doors you imagined earlier begin to feel less like mysteries and more like safeguards built during centuries when a misplaced document could destabilize kingdoms. Perhaps the Apostolic Chamber's missing materials remain locked away not out of malice but out of a long-standing reflex for caution. After all, financial truth is often sharp-edged. It reveals motivations, dependencies, and vulnerabilities with more clarity than theological treatises ever could. Still, scholars continue to debate the heart of the matter. Some argue that the idea of deliberately concealed financial files is romantic nonsense projected onto an institution that is simply old and complex. Others believe that every powerful institution possesses a hidden financial history and that the Vatican is no exception. And lingering quietly between these positions is the simplest and most unsettling question of all: if the Apostolic Chamber truly maintained emergency files that no catalog now acknowledges, what story were they protecting? A debt forgiven, a deal struck, a compromise made in the shadows to keep the Church afloat. You feel the answer hovering just beyond reach, as if pressed against the other side of a locked door. The silence around it is not empty. It is intentional, shaped by centuries of discretion. And as you take another slow step through this imagined labyrinth, the whispers of those files follow you like a soft echo, hinting that the real mystery may not be what the documents recorded, but why someone decided the world was not ready to read them. You continue drifting through the dim, imagined corridors, still carrying the faint rustle of those apostolic chamber whispers, when another thread of silence begins tugging at you, one woven not from ledgers or sealed rooms, but from letters that should exist and somehow do not. Every pope from the earliest centuries onward lived a life surrounded by correspondence. Letters flowed to kings, emperors, abbots, nuns, merchants, spies, explorers, and scholars. Some were appeals, some were confessions, and some were warnings dressed as blessings. Papal correspondence forms the nervous system of church history, transmitting thought and policy across continents, which makes the missing portions feel not merely peculiar, but deliberate. A firmly established fact sets the ground beneath your feet. The medieval papacy relied heavily on written communication, and surviving collections from certain centuries are astonishingly complete. The registers of Pope Innocent III, for example, survive in voluminous detail, documenting theological decisions and diplomatic strategies with almost administrative enthusiasm. Yet in other eras, often those marked by conflict, schism, or doctrinal uncertainty, letters vanish in clusters. Not one or two misplaced items, but whole sequences of correspondence expected to exist based on references in other documents. It is as though history paused mid-sentence and never resumed. You pause with it, standing before this imagined gap, the same way you might pause in front of a doorway that should lead somewhere familiar, but instead opens into darkness. The letters are not lost, like socks slipping behind furniture. They evaporate in patterns, and patterns invite questions. One obscure detail rarely discussed outside specialized circles adds a shimmer of intrigue. Among Renaissance-era archivists' personal notebooks, those little leather-bound volumes where clerks jotted work notes, complaints, and shopping lists, there are coded marks that seem to indicate removed correspondence. A small cross in the margin beside a reference number, or the letters SV believed by some to mean sub vice, implying something viewed only under supervision. A few scholars interpret these coded marks as signs that certain papal letters were transferred to special storage during politically sensitive years. Others dismiss them as mundane clerical marks. But the fact that such symbols appear repeatedly beside missing entries makes the debate difficult to ignore. You feel that familiar callback, rising a gentle echo from earlier explorations of the fortress-like structure and the keys held by a single authority figure. If single rooms can disappear from catalogs and entire financial files can slip into silent corners, then it becomes easier, almost natural, to imagine missing letters tucked into a private folio, their absence disguised as accidental loss. The pattern becomes less a leap of imagination and more a continuation of an established choreography of discretion. Another historical ripple deepens the mystery. During the Avignon papacy in the 14th century, when the papal court lived in France rather than Rome, Communication became a lifeline between competing factions within the Church. Letters flew between rival authorities, each trying to assert legitimacy. Yet modern historians note that during the final years of this divided era, surviving correspondence abruptly thins. Some explanations point to war plague or transportation problems. Others argue that the thinning aligns too neatly with political pressures strong enough to encourage selective disappearance. Whether the letters were destroyed, hidden, or simply never copied into registers remains a point of fierce debate. And that debate leads to an open question scholars still pose gently, often after a third cup of coffee. Whose responsibility was it to preserve or conceal papal correspondence? The popes themselves, their secretaries, the archivists who came centuries later. Preservation requires intention, but so does omission. When gaps occur in meaningful places, historians begin to wonder whether someone long ago chose which truths would thread into the future, and which would dissolve quietly like ink washed from parchment. You wander deeper into this imagined archival hush, contemplating how disappearance shapes narrative. A single missing letter can erase motive. 10 missing letters can reshape policy. Entire groups of missing letters can alter history's memory of a pope's intentions. And strangely, the absent letters often cast sharper shadows than surviving ones. It is not the content that troubles you, but the shape of the void they leave, like an erased figure in a painting whose outline still shows. Another thought flickers, gentle calm, and drawn from the shadows of an earlier observation about unnumbered rooms. It becomes easy to imagine that some correspondence ended up in precisely those spaces that catalogs no longer acknowledge. If a pope exchanged sensitive messages with a ruler, or navigated a theological dispute too volatile for posterity, the letters might have been set aside, waiting for a future more mature than the present. And if that future never arrived, those pages may still rest there now, unvisited, untouched, dimmed by centuries. A more controversial interpretation circulates quietly among ecclesiastical historians. It suggests that certain letters might reveal disagreements between popes and their closest advisors, nothing scandalous, simply human friction in times of stress. Perhaps a pope expressed doubt, frustration, or fear in private writing. Such vulnerability, though deeply relatable, might have been considered dangerous for future theologians to study. Not because emotion is shameful, but because doctrine thrives on clarity, not nuance. A single hesitant phrase in a pope's handwriting can inspire a century of misinterpretation. Still, there are those who push back against this theory, arguing that historians romanticize absence far too easily. They insist the missing correspondence is the result of damaged humidity worms, floods, invasions, or plain human error. Paper is fragile after all, and perhaps they are right. Perhaps nothing unusual occurred beyond the steady, inevitable decay of the physical world. Yet you can't help noticing how the missing periods align with sensitive eras, schisms, reformations, political crises, doctrinal turning points. Silence appears strategically placed, like commas guiding history into smoother sentences. As you drift onward, another callback surfaces gently from the apostolic chamber's vanished records. Financial mysteries and missing letters often intersect, after all. A pope negotiating loans or paying ransoms might write things he preferred not to preserve. Money leaves marks. Words leave evidence. Sometimes removing the evidence is easier than reshaping the story. And so you find yourself returning to the quiet question that threads through your entire journey: what truth would require so much silence? Perhaps the missing correspondence contains nothing revelatory at all, mundane exchanges, forgotten notes, trivial administrative details. Or perhaps they hold the raw human heart of decisions later painted as purely divine. you may never know. Yet the possibility is enough to keep you walking forward through this imagined world of shelves and shadows, listening for the quietest paper rustle, hoping one day a missing voice might speak again. You move deeper into the labyrinth of silence, carrying with you the delicate unease from those missing papal letters, and soon a heavier shadow begins to form around you, one rooted not in diplomacy or finance, but in fear. For centuries, nothing threatened the Church more profoundly than heresy. Not armies, not plagues, not the rise and fall of kingdoms. Heresy was the crack that could splinter unity from within, and the Church treated it with a seriousness that shaped entire eras, which makes the persistent hints of hidden heresy dossiers feel both inevitable and strangely fragile, as though touching them might stir the dust of something long asleep. You start with one undeniable historical fact. The Church conducted investigations into alleged heresy throughout the Middle Ages and well into the early modern period, assembling testimonies, trial records, confessions, denunciations, and judgments. Surviving documents from the Inquisition show meticulous handwriting and carefully transcribed interrogations. They reveal procedures, fears, and the intricate dance between theology and human uncertainty. Yet curiously, not all trials referenced in broader Church paperwork appear in the archives today. Some are incomplete. Others exist only in second-hand mentions. A few vanish entirely, despite compelling references that they once existed. Scholars accept that loss is inevitable across centuries, but certain omissions feel too pointed, too cleanly excised. This curiosity leads to an obscure detail that surfaces occasionally among experts. A 17th-century archivist, known for his thoroughness, once drafted an internal memorandum describing investigative folders unsuitable for ordinary shelving. The memorandum itself survives only in fragments, yet 3 lines remain readable, each bearing a reference number that corresponds to no existing file. The archivist noted that the folders contained testimonies not harmonized with canonical resolution. The phrasing is enigmatic, offering just enough meaning to unsettle. Some historians interpret this as code for unresolved accusations or politically sensitive cases that ended quietly without formal judgment. If such testimonies existed, they would have been deeply inconvenient, neither condemnable nor exonerating, hovering in theological limbo. You feel the echo of earlier mysteries stirring gently through this idea. The unnumbered rooms, the prefect's hidden authority, the missing correspondence, all these elements resemble puzzle pieces, arranged around the notion of controlled access. It wouldn't be surprising if unresolved or explosive heresy documents were similarly shielded. The Church has always been cautious with ambiguity. Doctrine prefers clarity. A dossier that raises more questions than answers creates ripples, and the archive has long been tasked with smoothing ripples before they become waves. You drift further along this path, letting the thought settle as gently as falling ash. Another historical thread emerges drawn from documented inquisitorial practices. In many regions, inquisitors were required to submit copies of records to Rome, particularly in cases involving unusual theological claims or politically connected individuals. Scholars have noted, however, that these transmissions often appear incomplete. Sometimes an inquisitor's notes refer to a confession sent to superiors, while Rome's shelves reveal no trace of it. The standard explanation involves damage, copy errors, or bureaucratic mishaps. Still, the consistency of the gaps from certain hotspots, southern France, the Rhineland, the fringes of Iberia, keeps curiosity alive. It's easy to imagine a quiet room somewhere set aside precisely for these uncertain documents. Not to hide wrongdoing, but to prevent theological confusion. Some accusations may have stemmed from misunderstandings, linguistic differences, or political rivalries, masquerading as spiritual disputes. Others may have involved ideas ahead of their time, concepts, harmless today, but volatile in context. And so you begin to picture a shelf filled with testimonies too delicate to handle publicly preserved, not for condemnation or instruction, but because disposing of them felt equally risky. A controversial interpretation surfaces softly within academic circles, the possibility that some heresy dossiers contain early expressions of ideas that later became mainstream. Perhaps a mystic speculated about divine love in language that resembled later theology. Perhaps a scholar questioned a scriptural interpretation now widely accepted. If so, suppressing the record may not have been deceitful. It may have been protective, shielding vulnerable thinkers from future misreadings. Yet this theory raises an open question. If the Church later embraced ideas once considered dangerous, why not eventually release the earlier attempts? Was the concern doctrinal confusion, historical embarrassment, or simply the inertia of long-standing secrecy? You pause with this question, feeling it resonate quietly through the imagined corridors. It recalls the missing letters, the way silence sometimes functions as caution rather than concealment. You sense again the texture of discretion woven into the archival walls, an understanding that not all truths become clearer with age. Some become more volatile, more easily twisted by modern assumptions or agendas. A faint callback arises from the apostolic chamber mystery. Just as financial documents might have revealed sensitive negotiations, heresy files could expose interpersonal dynamics between high-ranking clergy and suspected thinkers. Perhaps a future saint once entertained an idea briefly misinterpreted. Perhaps a powerful noble used accusations as political leverage. Such stories would complicate the neat chronology of sanctity and authority, and not every institution welcomes complexity. Simplicity, after all, is easier to teach. Nuance is harder to shepherd through centuries. And yet even now, scholars continue searching. Not because they expect scandal, but because they yearn for context, those missing pieces that illuminate the edges of belief. Many argue that suppressed heresy documents would showcase the Church's internal struggles with ideas that evolved over generations. They suggest that the hidden pages might reveal courage, intellectual bravery, and the slow human process through which doctrine becomes refined. Others remain skeptical, insisting that such dossiers, if they exist, probably contain routine procedural fragments with limited historical significance. In this debate, hope and caution mingle like dust in lamplight. As you walk through the imagined archive, you notice how naturally this possibility fits within the rhythm established by earlier mysteries. Rooms without catalog numbers, keys held by a single guardian, financial files that survived only as whispers. All of these prepare the mind to understand how heresy dossiers might slip into obscurity. It is not malice guiding the silence, but the instinct of an institution navigating centuries of turbulence. You picture a parchment sealed centuries ago, tucked inside a leather folder whose edges have darkened with time. Its ink might record the trembling words of a frightened villager or the confident arguments of a scholar whose thoughts strayed just enough from accepted belief to spark concern. Whatever the content, the document remains asleep in its hidden resting place, undisturbed by the world it once feared. And as you leave this thought behind, moving slowly toward the next shadowed mystery, the whisper of those dossiers lingers, a reminder that sometimes the most revealing truths are not the ones preserved for study, but the ones set gently aside, waiting for a world patient enough to understand them. You drift onward through the hush of the imagined archive, still carrying the soft echo of those heresy dossiers, when another kind of silence begins to form ahead of you. One shaped not by accusation or secrecy, but by decisions that forged the very architecture of Christian belief. The early church councils were gatherings where doctrine crystallized, where bishops traveled on dusty roads for weeks to debate, deliberate, and occasionally argue with a passion that would make modern committees blush. Their decisions shaped centuries. Their transcripts, where they survive, are treasures. And their missing portions, well, those are something else entirely. You begin with a solid historical anchor. The Council of Nicaea in 325 produced canons, creeds, and disputed minutes that still guide theology today. Surviving accounts show heated debates over the nature of Christ, the calculation of Easter, and issues that may seem oddly practical for such a mythic moment. Other councils, Chalcedon, Ephesus, Constantinople, generated equally rich records. Yet scholars note perplexing inconsistencies. Some councils mentioned in contemporary letters lack surviving transcripts altogether. Others have partial accounts with abrupt breaks, as though someone paused mid-sentence, and the rest of the page quietly dissolved into air. You pause with that image, sensing the familiar pattern that has followed you through the archive silence shaping the edges of narrative. The early councils were, after all, moments of high tension. Identifying the bounds of orthodoxy meant confronting competing interpretations, and sometimes those interpretations were advanced by individuals of enormous influence. When accounts vanish from periods where debates were especially intense, historians naturally wonder why. An obscure detail deepens this curiosity. Among the papers of a 16th-century editor tasked with compiling conciliar texts, there exists an unfinished marginal note referring to old acts preserved in the Roman repositories unsuitable for public reading. The editor never published anything more on the subject. The note appears as a passing reference, almost casual, as though its meaning were obvious to contemporaries. But to modern scholars, it is a tantalizing riddle. What kind of council document would be unsuitable for publication? Too fragmentary, too controversial, or too revealing of disagreements later smoothed over? The mind drifts gently to earlier reflections on the prefect whose keys shape access. If missing papal correspondence could dissolve into silent corners, and if delicate heresy records could be tucked away in unlisted spaces, it feels almost natural that certain council materials might be preserved in similarly cautious ways. These were foundational debates, after all, moments when theology was still malleable, evolving through human voices, rather than settled by later consensus. Perhaps some of those voices expressed ideas the Church did not ultimately adopt. Perhaps some argued passionately for positions later deemed incorrect. Preserving those arguments might invite misunderstanding, especially in eras when theological precision was crucial for unity. Another established fact enriches this contemplation. Several early councils produced multiple versions of their acts, some official, others recorded independently by attendees. These parallel accounts sometimes contradict one another. In a few cases, differences are so striking that historians still puzzle over which, if either, reflects what truly occurred. When documents conflict, institutions must decide which version to endorse. One version becomes the narrative. The others become curiosities, and curiosities sometimes slip into shelves far quieter than the ones used by visiting scholars. As you glide deeper into this imagined world, you recall the soft discomfort felt when encountering the apostolic chamber files and the missing papal letters. Patterns repeat not through redundancy, but through resonance. The archive feels increasingly like a living organism whose instincts prioritize continuity over chaos. If a transcript contained vigorous argumentation later resolved in a different direction, perhaps keeping it accessible felt unhelpful. Not deceptive, just cautious guarding developing doctrine from misinterpretation. But scholars predictably disagree. A controversial interpretation suggests that some lost accounts may record theological positions later condemned as heresy. Not because the bishops themselves were heretics, but because the debates were lively, untidy, and full of intellectual experimentation. Ideas don't usually arrive in polished form. They wander, stumble, evolve. A candid transcript might show influential figures advocating positions they later abandoned. Modern readers lacking context might misread those moments as doctrinal instability rather than honest exploration. Those who support this interpretation argue that the Church may have spared future generations considerable confusion by preserving only the finalized, unified outcomes. Others reject this entirely, proposing instead that the lost materials were simply misplaced during centuries of war reform and reorganization. The ancient world relied on fragile media papyrus parchment ink easily damaged by humidity or insects. Fires consumed libraries. Crusades and invasions disrupted storage. The archive's long history of relocations provided countless opportunities for loss. According to these scholars, the missing conciliar records are simply ghosts of time, not victims of intentional secrecy. Yet this argument, while sensible, leaves certain patterns unexplained. Why do some councils retain almost excessive documentation, while others from critical theological periods offer only thin traces? Why do references to specific deliberations appear in letters and chronicles when no corresponding acts survive? And why do the absences often cluster around topics that remained contentious for decades? You let these questions settle softly around you like dust drifting through lamplight. They do not accuse, nor do they demand certainty. They simply suggest that history often leaves its most intriguing footprints, not in what survived, but in what quietly disappeared. A callback to the earlier unnumbered rooms emerges almost naturally now. You imagine a chamber accessible only through discreet approval, containing fragile folios too nuanced for general study. Not suppressed, simply paused, waiting for a moment, when context, language, and theological maturity align. That moment may never arrive, or perhaps it has already arrived without anyone realizing it. But the documents remain in their slumber, wrapped in silence. A more human possibility surfaces gently. Early councils were not just theological gatherings, they were political theaters. Bishops held power territories, rivalries, and emotions. Disagreements could become heated. Personal letters of the time describe delegates storming out, refusing signatures, or appealing directly to emperors. Perhaps some lost accounts recorded moments of human frustration, weakness, or unflattering behavior. Not scandal, merely imperfect humanity, something institutions sometimes prefer to smooth from the permanent record. And so you move through this imagined world, listening not for loud revelations, but for the faintest shift in the quiet. Somewhere within the archive's depths may lie transcripts that reveal alternate versions of debates the world now knows only by their outcomes. Maybe they contain nothing extraordinary. Maybe they contain insights that would illuminate the earliest struggles to articulate a coherent faith. Or maybe they contain questions so delicately poised that even today they would require careful reading, patient study, and deep generosity of interpretation. You cannot know for certain. But the mystery keeps you walking slowly, gently, as though your footsteps might awaken those forgotten voices, still waiting in the quiet, preparing to speak again, if anyone ever finds the courage and the key to open their resting place. You continue drifting through the quiet, letting the memory of those early councils trail behind you, like the soft end of a fading chant when another kind of gap in the archives begins to draw your attention. One shaped not by theology or doctrine, but by geography, exploration, and the long reach of missionary ambition. The Vatican once maintained a global network of observers long before the idea of international reporting existed. Priests, diplomats, envoys, merchants sympathetic to the Church, and travelers carrying letters of introduction moved across continents, sending back sketches of lands, customs, languages, and political climates. Their reports helped shape decisions about evangelization, diplomacy, and sometimes even military strategy. And yet, certain regions, precisely the ones where you would expect the richest documentation, appear suspiciously thin in the surviving collections. You begin with a firmly established historical fact. In 1622, the Church created the Sacred Congregation for the propagation of the faith, commonly known as Propaganda Fide, to coordinate missionary activity worldwide. The institution assembled maps, linguistic studies, ethnographies, and political briefings from Asia, Africa, and the Americas. These materials were used to train missionaries and evaluate the success of various initiatives. Many of those documents survive and are openly studied today. Scholars marvel at their detail, the careful renderings of river systems in Asia, the descriptions of mountain passes in the Andes, and notes on tribal alliances that in some cases predated European cartographers' knowledge by decades. Yet alongside this abundance lies a peculiar absence, entire subjects hinted at by marginal notes. Travel diaries and external correspondence appear nowhere in the official holdings. One obscure detail surfaces from a 17th-century missionary's notebook discovered in a Portuguese monastery. The writer describes preparing a report for Rome concerning lands beyond the known route, which must be delivered to the chamber in utmost discretion. The phrase "lands beyond the known route" has puzzled historians for decades. Geographically, it could refer to inland regions of Africa or unexplored sections of Southeast Asia. But the reference to extreme discretion hints that the report contained something sensitive, not merely geographic curiosity. Some speculate that the region was politically contested. Others argue that it may have involved cultural practices or beliefs that missionaries struggled to contextualize. The report itself has never been located. Only the missionary's note remains hovering in the margins like a ghost of information that someone once worked very hard to communicate. You let that ghost linger for a moment, and in the silence, a familiar callback begins to rise. The earlier mysteries, the unnumbered rooms, the missing letters, the sealed financial files, all share a pattern of selective disappearance. Not random loss, not careless misfiling, but deliberate narrowing of what survives. Forbidden maps and vanished mission reports seem to fit this rhythm. Geography is political. Information about distant cultures can inspire admiration or, in the wrong hands, exploitation. And revelations about missionary failures, misunderstandings, or conflicts might complicate the triumphant narratives preserved elsewhere. Another historical thread adds texture. Early Jesuit missionaries in China and Japan produced some of the most detailed ethnographic and linguistic records of the early modern period. Their letters reveal not only admiration for local customs, but also moments of deep cultural conflict. A few of those reports circulated widely in Europe, inspiring philosophical debates about the nature of civilization. But many more remain fragmentary, hinted at only through later references. A French Jesuit once wrote that he had seen a map so detailed that it would trouble statesmen, a phrase scholars still quote with bemused fascination. Was he exaggerating? Possibly. But the idea that certain maps might provoke political anxiety is hardly far-fetched. Borders, after all, were fluid during that era. A drawing of a river's true course could validate one kingdom's claim and unravel another's. This brings you to an open question that researchers continue to debate. Gently, were some maps hidden because they contradicted the political narratives promoted by European powers? Or were they concealed because they documented cultures in ways that challenged theological assumptions? For instance, missionaries sometimes encountered societies with sophisticated legal systems, astronomical knowledge, or philosophical traditions as complex as those of Europe. A few letters admitted with candid surprise that these systems rivaled or surpassed Western models. Perhaps these reports were preserved only for internal study, never intended for broader circulation. A subtle callback surfaces from the heresy dossiers. Just as unusual theological speculation could be tucked away to prevent confusion, certain geographic reports might have been withheld for fear of inspiring admiration that threatened Eurocentric perspectives. Not maliciously, simply cautiously. Institutions navigating unfamiliar worlds often tread softly when documenting them. Another intriguing interpretation arises among scholars who specialize in historical cartography. They propose that some maps may have recorded routes used by clandestine envoys or local guides whose cooperation needed protection. Revealing such routes could endanger communities or compromise future missions. In this reading, hidden maps represented prudence rather than secrecy. A path into a kingdom wary of foreign influence might be documented only for the next missionary, not for posterity. Still, the pattern of absence is too consistent to ignore. Certain regions, Tibet, Central Africa, inland Amazonia, appear in missionary letters, but not in the official archive maps. Reports mention difficult terrain, uncooperative rulers, unexpected teachings or rituals unfamiliar to Europeans. These phrases appear tantalizingly in surviving correspondence, but the full documents that should accompany them remain missing. Perhaps they were destroyed, or perhaps they were stored in one of those hidden rooms you've come to imagine so vividly. A room where delicate materials were kept away from eyes that might misinterpret or politicize them. You picture one of those forbidden maps, now folded parchment edges softened by time ink, slightly blurred by humidity. Perhaps it shows a river no European had seen annotated with symbols whose meaning has faded. Perhaps it reveals the existence of a settlement long since abandoned. Or perhaps it contains nothing extraordinary at all, just the honest impressions of a weary traveler who saw the world through hopeful eyes. And yet even the ordinary can be powerful. A simple observation about a distant culture might complicate carefully curated narratives. A note about peaceful coexistence between religious groups might challenge assumptions, fueling missionary urgency. A documented failure might be easier to forget than explain. Another callback rises from the prefect's quiet authority. If volatile geographic or cultural documents existed, reports that needed careful framing, they might have been set aside until someone could evaluate their broader impact. Perhaps that evaluation never came. Or perhaps the documents were deemed too delicate to release, not because they threatened doctrine, but because they revealed a world too vast, too varied, too wondrous to fit neatly into the expectations of the time. As you wander further through the imagined archive, the mystery of these missing maps settles over you gently like a warm dusk. You realize the intrigue lies not in speculation, but in the quiet understanding that every map reveals as much about the mapmaker as about the land. And if some maps are missing, it may be because they illuminated truths the world was not yet ready to navigate. You continue drifting through the hush of the imagined archive, the memory of those forbidden maps still lingering like faint ink stains on your thoughts when another kind of silence begins to gather, one shaped not by geography or doctrine, but by lives that nearly became legend. Sanctity is not merely a spiritual recognition. It is an administrative process, a legal category, a narrative sculpted with care. For every saint the Church canonizes, there are countless others whose causes were begun, debated, celebrated, doubted, and ultimately never completed. Their files, if they survive, form a strange liminal genre of history stories, too remarkable to forget, too complicated to elevate and perhaps too politically delicate to let circulate freely. And so the idea of an archive of unmade saints has taken on an almost mythical quality among those who study the shadows of ecclesiastical bureaucracy. You start with one established fact. The canonization process has existed in formalized form since at least the 12th century, involving inquiries, witness depositions, examinations of reported miracles, and theological evaluations of a candidate's life. These materials were meticulously documented. Many survive in astonishing detail, whole volumes dedicated to the recounting of visionary experiences, medical wonders, ascetic feats, and character testimonies from neighbors who alternated between admiration and envy. Yet historians note that numerous announced causes, some even public, seem to vanish from the record entirely. No explanation, no closure, just a quiet disappearance that leaves behind a shadow where a story should be. An obscure detail adds a soft shimmer of intrigue. In the early 18th century, a papal secretary referenced almost in passing deferred sanctity cases stored under restricted observation. The phrasing was peculiar enough to catch the attention of modern scholars. These were not rejected cases. Rejections are normally documented. They were deferred, suspended, put on pause in a way that suggests not failure but hesitation. The secretary did not elaborate on what made these cases sensitive. Perhaps the candidate had powerful enemies? Perhaps political tensions rendered their story inconvenient. Or perhaps the evidence contained elements that needed careful stewardship. You let that term drift through your mind, remembering how often discretion has shaped the mysteries you've encountered already. Rooms without catalog numbers, missing letters, financial records whispered into silence, heresy testimonies that raised questions without answers. Against that backdrop, the notion of unmade saints becomes another piece of the same quiet mosaic stories, preserved not to deceive but to protect. And yet, as you walk deeper into this thought, another historical thread appears with gentle clarity. Throughout the Renaissance and Baroque eras, the Church navigated intense political landscapes. Monarchs pressured Rome to canonize figures aligned with their interests. Rival factions opposed candidates who symbolized competing ideologies. In this atmosphere, a saint could become a political asset, or a political liability. When a candidate's life intersected with controversies, rebellions, disputed visions, accusations of doctrinal irregularity, the Church often slowed the process. Sometimes it paused indefinitely. The records associated with such cases might have been stored separately to prevent misinterpretation during turbulent periods. This leads to an open scholarly question that carries a soft, persistent weight. What became of the testimonies gathered during these suspended causes? Depositions, miracle reports, character assessments. These were not trivial scraps. They were entire narratives of spiritual longing, human suffering, devotion, doubt, and community memory. Did they simply fade into misfiled obscurity? Or were they intentionally moved into the quiet corners of the archive where fragile stories are guarded from sensationalism? A gentle callback arises from the earlier exploration of heresy dossiers. Some unmade saints were mystics whose experiences walked a fine line between profound and questionable. The Church did not always know how to interpret them. A visionary who describes celestial encounters in language unfamiliar to theologians might inspire awe or concern. If their mystical expressions strayed too close to theological ambiguity, their causes might stall. Not because they were fraudulent, but because the Church lacked clarity. In such cases, storing the records discreetly would have been a gesture of prudence rather than concealment. Another interpretation whispered among scholars suggests that some unmade saints lived lives too honest, too raw, too human to fit comfortably into the polished mold later required for canonization. A holy person embarrassed a bishop. A miracle was reported by someone considered unreliable. A virtuous figure expressed frustration with church leadership in private letters. Such complexities, mundane as they may seem today, might have been difficult to present publicly. Files documenting these nuances could have been preserved quietly important, but not suitable for veneration. You wander deeper into this possibility, imagining one of these suspended dossiers resting in a hidden room, its parchment edges curled by age. Perhaps it contains a villager's heartfelt testimony about a healer whose touch eased pain. Perhaps it records the doubts of a candidate who confessed spiritual dryness during difficult years. Perhaps it preserves the quiet heroism of a nun whose charity threatened local political interests. None of these stories would be scandalous. They would simply be human, and humanity is often the most delicate thing to preserve. A soft callback rises again from earlier reflections on the prefect's keys. If sensitive materials required careful curation, whether maps, financial ledgers, or dossiers, the authority to decide their fate would rest with that office. A stalled canonization cause might be placed not in a catalogued shelf, but in a space awaiting a future judgment that never arrived. Over time, such a space could slip into the fabric of unlisted rooms, hidden by nothing more dramatic than the slow drift of administrative memory. Still, historians debate the heart of the matter. Some argue that the missing files never existed at all, that the causes were abandoned before documentation began. Others insist that the materials must survive somewhere, because references to them appear in letters, diaries, and ecclesiastical announcements. And among the most hopeful scholars, there is a belief, soft, persistent, almost devotional, that these lost stories contain extraordinary glimpses into everyday sanctity. Not miracles or visions, but simple kindness. Quiet endurance. Lives made holy by patience rather than spectacle. As you drift toward the end of this thought, the intrigue settles into something unexpectedly gentle. The archive of unmade saints is not a chamber of secrets, but a chamber of unfinished stories. Stories waiting for a world patient enough to read them with nuance, empathy, and understanding. You sense that somewhere in the quietest corner of the Vatican's depths, a stack of parchment still holds these nearly saints in suspended breath, neither forgotten nor celebrated, simply resting. Perhaps one day someone will open those folios again, or perhaps their sanctity was always meant to remain unspoken, illuminating only the quiet path you now walk, step by soft step, deeper into the mysteries the archive still shelters. You move onward through the dim, imagined corridors, still feeling the quiet breath of those unmade saints hovering behind you, when another kind of absence begins to take shape, an absence defined not by individuals whose causes stalled, but by entire communities that dissolved into history's margins. Religious orders have risen and fallen across centuries, some flourishing into global networks, others disappearing so thoroughly that only faint traces survive. Their disappearances were not always dramatic. Some faded gently, others were forcibly suppressed. A few were swallowed by political upheaval or doctrinal tension. And so you begin to sense the edges of another mystery, the files on vanished orders that appear nowhere in the public inventories of the Vatican archives, yet consistently flicker through hints, references, and the soft caution of archivists who discuss them only indirectly. A firmly established fact anchors your exploration. The Church has suppressed multiple orders throughout history, the most famous example being the Knights Templar in the early 14th century. When the Templars were dissolved, their properties were seized, many members were arrested, and Rome received reports, records, and confessions from across Europe. Some of those documents survive and have been studied extensively, but others, particularly materials from regions that resisted the suppression or conducted investigations, reluctantly never reappear in any official list. Historians accept that some losses were simply the product of political chaos. Yet certain missing clusters correspond suspiciously to areas known for having maintained loyalty to the order longer than the papacy preferred to acknowledge. As you pause with this thought, an obscure detail surfaces, one tucked inside the marginal notes of a 15th-century archivist. He jotted a brief reference to old testimonies of dissolved brotherhoods placed under restricted custody. The reference number he used corresponds to no surviving file, and the archivist did not elaborate on what made these brotherhoods noteworthy. Scholars debate whether he meant the Templars, the Beguines, the Fraticelli, or some entirely different community lost to time. The phrasing restricted custody echoes earlier whispers, soothing yet unmistakably cautious, the archival equivalent of placing a fragile glass under a bell jar. You let that caution drift through your thoughts, noticing how naturally it aligns with the rhythm of secrecy established in earlier mysteries. Unnumbered rooms, missing letters, hidden financial reports, and now entire orders whose historical footprints evaporate at key moments. One cannot help imagining that if volatile theological or political dynamics once surrounded these groups, their documents may have been gathered into a room where only seasoned archivists and perhaps the prefect with his quiet set of keys ever tread. But this mystery broadens beyond the famous cases, reaching into quieter histories. Many small medieval groups dedicated themselves to spiritual poverty, radical charity, or contemplative prayer. Some were admired, others were viewed with suspicion. The Beguines, for example, were semi-autonomous communities of laywomen who lived devoutly without taking formal vows. Their theology was generally orthodox, but some members expressed mystical ideas that later drew scrutiny. Surviving Inquisition records mention interrogations of Beguines whose writings were seized for evaluation. The problem is that the interrogations reference documents, poems, prayers, reflections that no longer exist in archives accessible to scholars. This leads to an open question often debated in gentle tones. Were these writings simply lost, or were they removed from circulation to prevent doctrinal confusion? Mystical language has a way of resisting precise interpretation. A phrase meant to describe union with God can sound dangerously ambiguous, especially when read centuries later, without its original emotional context. Perhaps the Church preserved these fragile writings in a place protected from misinterpretation. A callback surfaces now from the earlier heresy dossiers. Just as unresolved testimonies might have been set aside for safety, the documents of vanished orders may have been preserved quietly to avoid rekindling debates long settled. Not every disappearance was the result of wrongdoing. Some orders simply became entangled in local political tensions. A single bishop's accusations, a feud between families, or an economic dispute could spiral into formal suppression. The records from such cases might contain personal grievances, unflattering remarks, or unbalanced accusations, nothing scandalous in essence but too messy to elevate into public study. Another historical thread reveals an intriguing nuance. During the Counter-Reformation, the Church sought to present a unified, orderly front in a time of intense external criticism. Appearance mattered, clarity mattered, cohesion mattered. Records documenting chaotic or fragmented aspects of internal history may have seemed unhelpful for a world already eager to find flaws. It is possible that files detailing dissolved orders were stored separately, not to hide wrongs, but to maintain focus on the institutions that endured. And yet scholars disagree sharply about the fate of these vanished documents. Some argue that entire trunks of material letters, rulebooks, communal charters, devotional writings must still exist somewhere, because multiple medieval chroniclers refer to their preservation. Others argue that the documents were simply destroyed as part of local legal procedures, a fate common during suppression decrees. But the tone of the archival references, the careful hints, the repeated mentions of restricted custody makes outright destruction seem less likely. Institutions rarely destroy materials unless absolutely necessary. Far more often, they tuck them away where they cannot be misread. You drift deeper along this line of thought, imagining one of those lost compilations, resting silently in a locked room. Perhaps it contains the final letter of a Templar knight, trying to explain his innocence to a distant relative. Perhaps it holds the contemplative writings of a Beguine whose mystical metaphors shimmered with sincerity, but lacked doctrinal precision. Perhaps there is a small stack of charters from a brotherhood, dissolved not for spiritual fault, but because its land was needed by a rising political faction. Each possibility is achingly human, full of hope, fear, devotion, and misunderstanding. Another callback rises gently from your memory of the prefect's quiet authority. It becomes easy to imagine that someone in that role at some point in history was instructed to preserve these materials discreetly, not to disguise them, but to protect them from hasty conclusions, to ensure they would not be sensationalized, weaponized, or misunderstood by scholars lacking the full historical context. A different interpretation, controversial but persistent, is whispered among medievalists who study power dynamics more than spirituality. They suggest that some vanished orders may have stumbled into knowledge considered politically sensitive. A monastic house with connections to a rebellious noble family, for instance, might create documents reflecting alliances the Church later preferred to forget. Or an order may have produced geographic intelligence like the forbidden maps you encountered earlier that complicated diplomatic narratives. If such materials existed, they would have slipped very naturally into those hidden corners of the archive that seem to appear whenever discretion outweighs disclosure. Yet for all the speculation, a softer truth emerges as you walk further through the imagined quiet. Most vanished orders were not mysterious at all. They were simply human communities navigating difficult times. Their failures, their doubts, their struggles, their unsolved questions. These are not conspiracies. They are histories that require gentleness to read. And perhaps in the end, the Vatican understood that gentleness cannot always be guaranteed by the future. So the files remain where they are resting in shadows, not because they threaten doctrine, but because they reveal the vulnerable underside of devotion. Stories not polished into sainthood, not solidified into institutional history, but still too precious to discard. And as you step into the next corridor of this unfolding mystery, you carry with you the soft realization that sometimes entire worlds can disappear from the official narrative not because they were unworthy, but because their truths required a quieter kind of preservation. You move farther into the imagined archive, carrying the soft echo of vanished orders like faint footprints behind you, when another shadow stirs at the edge of the lamplight, one shaped not by missing communities or lost causes, but by rival claimants to the throne of Peter. Few subjects unsettle church historians more gently, yet more persistently, than the question of antipopes. Their existence is an established historical reality, woven through centuries in which rival factions, political pressures, and theological disputes occasionally produced more than one individual claiming the mantle of rightful successor to St. Peter. The Church eventually clarified legitimacy in each case, but the pathways to those clarifications are often far from tidy. You begin with a firmly grounded fact. During the Western Schism of the late 14th century, there were for a time 3 simultaneous claimants to the papacy, one in Rome, one in Avignon, and one briefly in Pisa. Each maintained its own curia-issued decrees, appointed cardinals, and corresponded with rulers. These competing administrations generated administrative records, diplomatic letters, financial accounts, and theological arguments. Yet the documentation from the Avignon and Pisan claimants survives only in tantalizing fragments. Scholars agree that much was lost through warfare, political consolidation, and the natural decay of parchment. Still, the pattern remains puzzling. Many documents referenced by contemporaries appear nowhere in modern holdings. Some seem to have dissolved almost too cleanly, as though swept aside to make room for the unified narrative that emerged. This puzzle deepens when you consider an obscure detail occasionally whispered among medievalists. In the mid-19th century, a Jesuit historian claimed to have seen a register of contested decrees from the Avignon line records he described as carefully maintained but withheld from ordinary inspection. His comment appeared in a private letter, not a published work, and the register he described has never resurfaced. Some believe he exaggerated. Others suspect that he stumbled upon a collection meant only for internal use containing documents that might complicate the later settled understanding of legitimacy. The phrase "withheld from ordinary inspection" gently echoes the tone of earlier mysteries, the subtle sense that certain truths are preserved more securely than others. You pause among these drifting shadows, and once again a callback arises from the earlier exploration of missing papal correspondence. Just as letters vanish precisely where disputes intensified, the records of rival papacies seem to thin at the moments where legitimacy was most contested. This does not imply deliberate manipulation. It reflects the nature of fragile documentation carried through turbulent times. Still, patterns of absence invite curiosity, and curiosity, once awakened, tends to follow its own quiet path deeper into the stacks. A historical thread now winds its way into your thoughts. During schismatic periods, popes and anti-popes both issued decrees intended to correct abuses, resolve conflicts, or strengthen their perceived authority. Some of these decrees conflicted sharply with one another. When unity was eventually restored, church authorities faced the delicate task of reconciling contradictory rulings without undermining institutional continuity. Scholars argue that this task may explain why certain decree registers disappeared. They simply created interpretive challenges too tangled for later administrations to untie. Not out of shame, but out of prudence. When two rival leaders declare contradictory things in the same year, preserving both records invites confusion. This leads naturally into a long-standing, open question. To what extent did the Church preserve the internal documentation of anti-papal courts after legitimacy was settled? Did archivists incorporate everything into central holdings? Or did some materials remain separate, deemed historically important, yet too context-dependent for general circulation? No consensus exists. Some historians insist all surviving materials were eventually integrated. Others believe a supplementary archive once existed, a quiet compartment, holding the records of contested papacies, accessible only to those charged with navigating the institution's most delicate continuities. You take a slow breath, sensing another callback rising, this time from the files of vanished orders. Just as dissolved communities left behind documents too nuanced to handle publicly anti-papal administrations, may have produced materials that captured the raw emotion of conflict appeals from clergy torn between loyalties, confessions from theologians who doubted their allegiance, diplomatic entreaties phrased with more desperation than certainty. Such documents, if preserved, might reveal how deeply the crisis fractured not only administration, but conscience. They would be extraordinarily valuable for understanding the human side of the schism, but also extraordinarily vulnerable to misreading by those unfamiliar with the pressures of the era. A more controversial interpretation, discussed carefully among church historians, suggests that some shadow papacy documents may record theological positions that were later abandoned. Not heresies, but provisional arguments crafted in the heat of dispute. If so, preserving them discreetly might have been an act of kindness to the individuals involved. No one wants a passing thought from a moment of crisis to be misinterpreted centuries later as a doctrinal stance. You imagine a room now not dramatic or glowing with secrets, but quiet. Dust settled gently across bound registers, a stack of parchment wrapped carefully in cloth. Perhaps a ledger containing lists of appointments made by an antipope, a record preserved for historical accuracy, but never publicly displayed, to avoid legitimizing an ephemeral authority. Perhaps letters written by bishops pleading for unity, their words revealing doubts unwelcome in later narratives that emphasized decisive resolution. Or perhaps nothing more mysterious than administrative notes from local clerics unsure which claimant to obey a normal human confusion that centuries of hindsight have smoothed away. And so you drift deeper into the imagination of this archive, letting the tension dissolve into curiosity. The shadow papacies are not sinister. They are simply the scars of a long institution navigating its own imperfections. The documents that survive tell one story. The documents that disappeared tell another. And the documents that may still exist in quiet rooms behind unlisted doors tell a story waiting for readers patient enough to understand the fragility of unity. As you continue walking forward, the sense grows that these mysteries, these gaps, whispers, and silences are not separate puzzles, but overlapping layers of the same phenomenon, an institution attempting to preserve not only its history, but the coherence of its story. And somewhere in that layered, quiet, rival popes and forgotten clerics still whisper through the parchment, their voices softened by time, awaiting the moment, if it ever comes, when the world is ready to listen without judgment. You move deeper into the imagined archive, carrying with you the softened murmur of those shadow papacies, when the atmosphere begins to shift again, becoming heavier, more recent, more human in a different way. Earlier mysteries lay deep in antiquity or the medieval past, softened by centuries of distance. But now, as you turn an imagined corner, the air feels charged with the 20th century's anxious electricity. War diplomacy, ideology, and survival begin to echo faintly through the stone. The Vatican lived through both world wars, the rise and fall of totalitarian regimes, and the ideological fractures of the Cold War. Its archivists documented everything: letters from diplomats pleading for help, reports from clergy trapped behind advancing armies, secret communications from envoys navigating persecution, and assessments of political alliances too fragile to articulate publicly. And so, another mystery takes shape. Whispers of wartime record rooms closed not for reasons of decay, but because the contents remain far too sensitive for universal study. Your understanding begins with a solid historical foundation. During the pontificate of Pius XV, the Vatican maintained an extensive network of observers across Europe, gathering information about deportations, persecutions, occupation zones, military movements, and humanitarian crises. These reports helped shape papal interventions, some public, some discreet. Much of this correspondence survives and has been made available to scholars in recent years. Yet researchers note that gaps still appear at crucial points: periods of intense diplomatic pressure, moments when alignments shifted rapidly, or intervals when emissaries reported extraordinary events. Sometimes references in one document point toward another that has never surfaced. These gaps are not enormous, but they are precise, appearing at the very places modern historians most wish to examine. This is where an obscure detail emerges from the quiet. In the 1970s, an archivist reviewing internal filing notes mentioned private rooms used for special wartime storage. a phrase that has since taken on a faint, legendary glow. He did not describe the rooms in detail. He did not reveal their location. He simply noted almost apologetically that certain materials had been isolated for reasons of diplomatic sensitivity. The note was not intended for public viewing. It appears in a personal journal rather than institutional correspondence. But it has fueled gentle, persistent speculation ever since. You let that phrase settle special wartime storage feeling. How naturally it aligns with the earlier rhythms of silence you have traced throughout the archive. This is an institution accustomed to caution. When lives were at stake, when negotiations depended on secrecy, when one misinterpreted document could spark retaliation, archivists may have acted with extraordinary care. A report from a priest sheltering refugees under the nose of a hostile regime could not simply sit on an open shelf. Neither could a letter from a diplomat describing atrocities he could not publicly accuse without endangering others. Concealment in this sense becomes protection. A historical thread now intertwines with this thought. During World War II, the Vatican operated a vast humanitarian initiative coordinating relief efforts, tracing missing persons, and negotiating sometimes desperately for prisoners' safety. Many of these operations relied on intermediaries whose involvement required strict confidentiality. Modern scholars have noted references to lists of names, coded correspondences, and reports from informants within hostile governments. But many of these referenced documents do not appear in open holdings. Whether they were destroyed, misplaced, or deliberately sequestered remains an open question. And that open question is the heart of ongoing debate. Some historians argue that certain wartime materials remain inaccessible, not because they are scandalous, but because they contain sensitive personal information. Names of individuals who sought help secretly, descriptions of families in hiding, or appeals from officials who risked their careers to pass information to Rome. Releasing such documents indiscriminately could reveal private suffering in ways neither respectful nor ethically justifiable. Others believe the missing materials document private negotiations, whose political implications still echo talks with resistance movements, quiet exchanges with ambassadors, or warnings delivered to governments unwilling to listen. A callback stirs from earlier reflections on the Apostolic Chamber files and the hidden heresy dossiers. In each case, absence did not imply wrongdoing. It reflected caution. Once again, you sense that these wartime gaps may follow the same instinct. Institutions often preserve the fragile parts of their story in places where only the most prepared readers can understand them fully. Yet another thread adds complexity. After the war, the Cold War began almost instantly, and the Vatican became a delicate player in information networks, stretching from Washington to Moscow. Priests behind the Iron Curtain sent reports that could endanger them if intercepted. Diplomats spoke candidly about ideological pressures and surveillance. Some historians propose that wartime and early Cold War materials were stored together, forming a single continuum of sensitive intelligence. If true, these documents would represent one of the most delicate collections in the archive, containing insights into governments, conflicts, and negotiations still relevant today. A controversial interpretation floats gently through scholarly discussions. It suggests that certain wartime files may record internal debates at the highest levels of the Church, moments when leaders weighed public statements against potential reprisals. Such discussions would not undermine the Church's narrative, but they might reveal the emotional complexity of decisions made under immense pressure. Some would read that complexity generously, others would weaponize it. And so archivists aware of how nuance can be flattened into accusation may have preserved such records in more protected spaces. You imagine one of those rooms, now quiet, climate-controlled perhaps, behind a security checkpoint. Inside are bundles of telegrams, letters written in hurried script, coded messages and reports from clergy describing horrors they witnessed firsthand. Some pages might be smudged from damp basements where they were written. Others might contain tiny details, names, dates, locations too personal to release freely. The room is not sinister. It is solemn. A callback to the prefect's keys arises naturally. If anyone knows which wartime materials remain sleeping in such rooms, it would be the one entrusted with their safekeeping. Not to hide truth, but to guard humanity. As you drift further along this imagined corridor, you feel the weight of these wartime pages not as scandal, but as sorrow. History is loud in books, but in archives it often whispers. The whispers here speak of fear, courage, risk, compassion, compromise, and the fragile hope that someday a safer world might be able to read these documents without turning human stories into political weapons. For now, the wartime rooms remain quiet. And perhaps that quiet is not a wall, but a breath held gently, waiting for the moment when opening the door would illuminate history without harming the people who once lived it. You move deeper still through the imagined archive, the solemn hush of those wartime rooms lingering like a soft pressure on your chest when a quieter, more elusive mystery begins to take form, one that archivists almost never acknowledge directly. It does not concern a specific dossier, nor a vanished room, nor a particular historical era. Instead, it concerns the possibility of something more structural, more foundational. A list, a ledger, an internal roadmap known only to the few who safeguard the archive from within. Scholars call it half-jokingly and half-reverently the unknown index, a master catalog said, to reference collections not found in any ordinary inventory. You begin with a grounded fact. Every large archive depends on layered finding aids, public indexes, internal registers, cross-referenced volumes, digital databases, and handwritten logs that track materials too fragile or too recently processed for general release. The Vatican is no exception. Its public catalog gives researchers access to a vast universe of documents spanning more than 12 centuries. Yet archivists have long admitted, gently indirectly, that internal catalogs exist to guide staff through materials not included in the public listings. This is standard practice. But what fuels fascination is the recurring suggestion whispered over decades that one such internal guide lists collections so sensitive, so context-dependent, that only a tiny number of archivists have ever seen the entries. The obscure detail that fuels this speculation comes from a brief remark in the memoir of a 20th-century Vatican librarian. Describing his early training, he noted that senior staff consulted certain directories not shared externally containing headings whose purpose was not explained to me. He offered no further elaboration. But that single passing phrase has become a kind of historical riddle. What headings, why concealed? And what does it mean for an archivist to consult them without explanation? You feel a faint callback from earlier mysteries, unnumbered rooms, missing papal letters, sealed wartime files, each hinting at the existence of knowledge preserved, but not openly mapped. The unknown index, if it exists, would not be a book of secrets in the cinematic sense. No gilded pages, no ominous warnings. More likely, it would be slim utilitarian, written in a hand prioritizing precision over drama. A ledger of references pointing archivists toward rooms, boxes, or bundles of documents reserved for careful handling. The idea feels strangely gentle, almost administrative, and yet the implications ripple outward, touching nearly every mystery that has accompanied you along this quiet journey. You pause imagining what might lead an institution to create such an index. Another established fact provides clarity. Over centuries, the Church has accumulated materials that are historically significant, but theologically delicate, politically sensitive, or ethically complex documents involving vulnerable individuals or diplomatic efforts that required confidentiality or theological debates that unfolded before consensus hardened. Archivists, guided by the responsibility to preserve history without causing unnecessary harm, may have separated these materials from ordinary circulation, not as suppression, but as stewardship. And so the unknown index becomes less a catalog of secrets and more a catalog of sensitivities, a guide for archivists navigating the fragile boundaries between access and protection. Still, scholars debate what might appear in such a register. One open question concerns classification. Would the index list full descriptions of restricted materials? Or would it instead offer cryptic shorthand brief notations whose meaning only trained archivists understand? Some researchers imagine entries like private correspondence, sensitive context, or conciliar acts unresolved, or mission reports, confidential sources. Others believe the headings would be even more subtle, revealing nothing to an uninitiated reader. This speculation recalls another earlier thread, the prefect's rumored personal log, the handwritten record of denied requests. The two possibilities intertwine in your thoughts. Perhaps the prefect's authority draws directly from this secretive catalog. Perhaps knowing what must remain undisturbed is as important as knowing what may be opened. And perhaps this internal catalog forms the quiet backbone of the archive's true structure, the map beneath the map. A controversial interpretation arises softly, never spoken loudly, by responsible scholars, but lingering nonetheless. It suggests that the unknown index may contain references to materials deliberately removed from public catalogs during politically sensitive eras. Not destroyed, merely relocated to a place where they could not be misinterpreted. These might include documents from suppressed orders, ambiguous mystical writings, alternative accounts of early councils, or reports that complicated diplomatic narratives. The idea is not sinister. Institutions often reorganize sensitive material into special collections. But the thought that such an index might exist and might guide archivists silently through centuries of carefully curated discretion carries a special fascination. You drift deeper into this imagined possibility. The unknown index could be nothing more than a bound notebook kept in a drawer, consulted rarely, updated quietly. Or it could be a set of internal ledgers preserved in a small room behind the prefect's office, the pages turned only when a question arises that touches on materials the general catalog cannot acknowledge. You picture a shelf labeled not with classification numbers, but with a simple handwritten tag, restricted consultation. Inside perhaps sits the ledger that has inspired so many years of gentle speculation. Another callback hums softly from your memory, the forbidden maps, the wartime rooms, the unmade saints. All these mysteries share a common thread, the idea that the archive's silence is not empty, but intentional. The unknown index could be the very tool that maintains this intentionality, ensuring that sensitive materials neither vanish nor surface unprepared. A kind of moral compass binding archivists across generations. Still, this leads you to the most delicate question of all: does knowing that such an index might exist change the meaning of the archive itself? Not really. If anything, it adds a layer of humanity. Archivists are guardians, not gatekeepers. They navigate competing responsibilities, preservation, discretion, empathy, historical truth, and they do so with the knowledge that every decision echoes into the future. The unknown index, whatever its nature, would be part of that balancing act. As you take another slow step through the imagined corridor, you begin to realize that the mystery lies not in what the index contains, but in what it represents. A quiet acknowledgement that history is not always ready for immediate exposure, that context matters, that truth sometimes needs time, and that documents carry the weight not only of what they record, but of how they will be read. Perhaps the index contains references to extraordinary materials. Perhaps it contains nothing unusual at all. You may never know. But the possibility itself becomes part of the archive's gentle allure. The idea that somewhere in a small room warmed by a single lamp rests a simple ledger holding the most delicate threads of the Vatican's long memory. And as you move forward toward the final mystery awaiting you, the unknown index lingers like a whisper in the quiet, a reminder that the greatest secrets are often hidden not by walls or keys, but by the discretion of those entrusted to preserve them. The silence seems to lengthen now, stretching out into something softer, something almost warm. You feel the pace of your thoughts easing as though the archive itself were guiding you gently toward rest. The corridors grow longer and quieter, the lamplight lowering into a dim amber glow. You imagine the dust settling on the shelves grain by grain until everything feels suspended in a slow, serene stillness. The mysteries no longer press for answers. They drift like fading echoes, comfortable in their unresolved shape. With every gentle breath, the heavy stone walls feel farther away, turning into something lighter, softer, more welcoming. Even the locked rooms slip into a peaceful blur, not forbidding, but restful, like doors in a dream you do not need to open. You feel yourself drifting with them, carried by the gentle rhythms of a place that has held centuries of secrets without ever raising its voice. Let the last traces of curiosity loosen their grip, letting your mind rest the way the archive rests, quiet, layered, timeless. When you're ready, allow your thoughts to dissolve into the calm, as though you're stepping slowly out of the corridors and into sleep itself.